I am excited about this conversation with Samantha. She is the assistant professor at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy and the author of Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, that was published last year. She's taught courses on disaster preparedness, recovery, and mitigation, on vulnerable populations in disaster, and on the political and legal foundations of emergency management. She's a co-founder of Disaster Researchers for Justice and the Center for Climate Adaptation Research. So, Samantha, I listened to your book, Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, and it's a personal story, as well as a story of the U.S. And our response or lack of response to the disasters that we have been facing. Can you start by telling us how you became an expert in emergency management?
Yeah, of course. So I first got started doing disaster work in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina and the federal levee failure. I was in high school. I grew up on the East Coast, but a group from my high school went down to help and volunteer for a week. And I ended up moving to New Orleans so that I could help with the recovery in the long term. And so I worked with all these different nonprofits that were kind of doing anything and everything that needed to be done in terms of recovery in the city, from physically rebuilding houses to helping fill out FEMA paperwork and insurance paperwork and all of those tasks that come with recovery. While I was living in New Orleans, the BP oil disaster happened along the coast. And so some of the environmental groups I worked with started driving down to the coast to help with organizing efforts and the community response there. And then I started kind of going to some other disasters across the country, up to Missouri after the Joplin tornado. And I started to notice that the challenges that we were having in New Orleans in terms of recovery that I had kind of initially thought were pretty unique to New Orleans and unique to the post-Katrina political situation were actually manifesting in very similar ways in all of these other places across the country. And so I started to think about how we respond to disasters, how we go through that recovery process at more of a systems level rather than at this kind of very on the ground community level. And in doing so, I ended up going to grad school, getting a doctorate in emergency management and learning much more from a research and kind of policy perspective, how we do emergency management, not just response and recovery, but the before things too, how we prepare for disasters, what we do to actually mitigate or prevent disasters from happening.
So we do some things well, is what I took from the book, and we do some things not so well. That the United States really has a robust infrastructure that we, can be proud of, because there's a lot of countries that do not have that kind of infrastructure that we have, dedicated to serve us when disasters occur. But those systems are only kind of designed to help to a point. So I think it's really important for our audience to describe, like, what can we count on and what can we not count on?
Yeah, so the U.S. emergency management system is something that probably most people don't really think about on a day-to-day basis unless you are going through a disaster yourself. But the emergency management system is operating all around us all of the time. That includes government agencies that are involved in the system. So FEMA at the federal level is the obvious one. We also have state and local emergency management agencies that are working every single day on these issues. We have other parts of government, HUD, EPA, CDC, they're all involved in emergency management in some way. But this system also includes the nonprofit sector, it involves the private sector, it involves each of us as individuals. And so we really do have this robust system in terms of thinking about how so many different stakeholders are involved. We also have a good kind of underlying philosophy, I would say, to emergency management, in that we need to be thinking about disasters comprehensively. So again, not just that response piece, but really thinking about how we're doing recovery and putting as many resources as possible towards mitigation and prevention. And so, like you said, we have this kind of infrastructure for this system across the country that's been in existence for 70 plus years or so. So we're not starting from scratch when it comes to having to deal with these disasters, where we have kind of two major problems with this system. One is that this system was not created to meet everybody's needs. Disasters impact people unequally, and sometimes our system doesn't necessarily meet those needs that different communities have. Communities of color, low income communities tend to see more significant impacts, have a more difficult time accessing aid through our emergency management system. So we need some major changes related to equity throughout the entire system. The second primary issue with this system is the kind of strain that is being put on this system as we're seeing an increase of our risk across the country, as we're seeing more and more climate-related disasters and non-climate related disasters too. Our emergency management system has been going nonstop, and unfortunately, we don't have as much capacity at the local level as we need. We haven't seen enough resources put towards the system at the federal level. And so we're seeing some real strain, burnout happening within this system.
Do you think that COVID has taught us anything about how to prepare for climate disasters that are going on?
I hope so. COVID has certainly been the most recent event that has really demonstrated the lack of capacity within our emergency management system. I know everybody uses the word unprecedented to describe COVID, but for our US emergency management system, it really was. There had never been an event in US history where every single emergency management agency at all levels across the country had to activate and deal with a disaster at once. And so we've definitely, I think, learned an important lesson about the lack of capacity in that system. And hopefully we take that and apply it to what the projections look like for future disasters as it relates to climate change.
Another distinction that I love that you made was the difference. There's disasters and there's catastrophes. And it sounded like, multiple disasters happening at once create catastrophes, or disasters in sequence create catastrophes, or just very large events. So if you could just talk a little bit about, what we're looking towards in the future around disasters and catastrophes, and, meaning really the next 3, 4, 5 years, how and what we can do individually and in our communities, and what we can advocate for nationally.
Yeah, so certainly there's a lot that we can do, right? We know that these climate-related disasters are already happening and will continue to happen. And so there is an urgent need to be taking as many actions as possible to make sure that ourselves and our communities are ready to respond to these types of events. So at the individual level, anything that you can be doing to prepare yourself and your family for these types of disasters is going to be really important. That's going to look really different depending on where you live, what specific risks you face, and of course, the resources that you have. But in general, if you're able to buy flood insurance, earthquake insurance, really think through where you're buying a house, if that's something that you're doing. Making sure that you have an emergency savings account if possible. Really learn about what disasters you and your family are at risk of where you live. At the community level, it's also really important that we're thinking about preparedness as a community, right? We tend to think about preparedness as being this really individualistic action that you take all of those things I just mentioned. But we don't go through disasters on our own. We are surrounded by other people when disasters happen. You have your friends, your family, your neighbors, your coworkers, the other people in your community. These events bring about collective responses. And so when we think about what is needed collectively to prepare, this is where really getting to know your neighbors, building out your social network in your community is really, really important. We know that's one of the most important resources you can have during a disaster is having people you can trust and ask for help from. Finding other people in your community that are concerned about disasters, concerned about your community's risks. There are a myriad of really incredible nonprofits, grassroots, mutual aid type groups all across the country that are working on various issues related to disasters. A lot of flood mitigation groups, a lot of groups that are helping respond to these events. So tying in and getting to know those groups, if your community doesn't have one, then starting one is a great thing to do. And then, of course, we need government action to address these problems within our emergency management system. I often call for comprehensive national emergency management reform. So within all levels of government, this is needed. At the federal level, we're looking at, pushing for much more investment towards mitigation efforts across the country. We know that for every dollar that we spend on mitigation, we can save at least $6 in response and recovery, not to mention the benefits to the community in terms of people not being affected. And really across the country at the local level, at the state level, we need to see a much, much greater investment in our local emergency management agencies. There are many communities across the country that have a part-time emergency manager. Some communities even have a volunteer emergency manager, let alone an entire agency with the kind of resources and expertise that is needed to truly plan and prepare for these types of events to protect our community. So seeing a financial investment at that local level is absolutely fundamental when we're thinking about building our capacity.
Such good advice. Yesterday, David Pogue talked about in his book about having a to-go bag. That's like one of the personal things. What other just really, and I do love making strong relationships with your neighbors, because we know that it's our neighborhoods or, that where people gather together. So that social capital that we build. Is there anything what about communications? You always want to tell someone you're okay or you're not okay. And if phone lines go down or.
Yeah, it's hard. Generally, emergency managers recommend having some kind of a communications plan among your friends or your family. Very often that will include having an out-of-state contact person. So if your grandmother lives out of state, then make her your contact person. So if something happens in your community, everybody in the family knows that she's the person to contact and have her kind of keep track of where everybody is. So there's kind of different ways that you can go about thinking about that communication issue. having a plan in advance among your family in terms of like meeting points and thinking through like evacuation plans ahead of time. All of that will help you out during an actual response.
And just tell us a little bit, Samantha, about what the rest of your year looks like. What kind of advocacy and speaking do you do to help people in the United States become themselves advocates, become prepared, and not face disasters blindly.
Yeah, so one of the major problems we have, or kind of underlying problems that we have in emergency management, is that a lot of people think they know a lot about disasters, but don't actually know as much as they think they know. We see disasters happening on the news all of the time. We are watching disaster movies from Hollywood. And again, unless you've kind of directly experienced a disaster yourself, your perceptions about what actually happens during disasters can be a bit skewed based on kind of inaccurate coverage. And so, and even if you have experienced a disaster, figuring out, kind of thinking of this like broader framework of disasters and understanding of how all these very different parts of the system fit together is really complicated. And it's not something that people very often have an opportunity to learn about. So I approach this in a couple different ways. So I am an assistant professor at Massachusetts Maritime Academy. I teach in an undergrad emergency management program. So I'm in that program, I'm teaching the next generation of emergency managers about this system, not only how to do emergency management and what the disaster research says, but what kind of changes are needed to this system moving forward, and helping them envision the kinds of tasks that they're going to have to do in emergency management 10, 20, 30 years from now. In addition to that, I do a lot of different public speaking engagements. I'm giving a TED Talk next week, doing all kinds of conferences and whatnot, particularly related to climate change, and helping folks that do climate work kind of understand that the EM system already exists, that we're not starting from scratch as we see these disasters increase across the country. Just trying to help people understand this system. Like I said, it is very complex and there aren't many opportunities to learn about it. But it's a system that impacts all of us. If it hasn't already, it will soon. And so it's important that people really understand how it works.
Yeah, well, thank you. The only disaster that I have been a part of was the 1986 earthquake in Mexico City. And of course, this is pre-internet. So we, went to the embassy and asked them to tell our families that we were okay, that I was okay, and I was 7 months pregnant. And they used ham radios, and like 3 days later, they heard that I was still alive. It seems that one of the big things is just don't panic. Don't panic and keep your wits about you. And you've helped me a lot in just doing this interview and reading your book. I am not a big preparedness person. I'm kind of like, I'll figure it out, no problem. To get my act together and think a little bit more about what I would need to do, or what I could ask my family to do, some of who live on the coasts, to be prepared. So that as a family, love the idea of picking a grandmother, although I'm the grandmother. That's fine. And they can pick me to do that. But thank you so much for being with us here. And I hope everyone in the audience also can take a little bit of time going forward and think about how we can all just be more prepared in the face of in the face of what our community or our town or others that we care about might face. So I'm Lisa Renstrom, a board member of Eco America, and I totally recommend Samantha's book. I listened to it on my phone, Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Back to you all at headquarters.
My name is Dr. Derek Sibrey Jr. I am a clinical psychologist within the state of Michigan and core faculty at the Michigan Schools of Psychology. And I'm happy to be here today to guide you through a meditation. So if you would to start, you'll take a slow, deep inhale, and then a complete exhale. Now, as you begin awareness of your breath, just start to notice what thoughts are going through your mind. You can feel free to focus on a point in the room or close your eyes. And just, what are you thinking about? Yeah, you don't want to get caught up in your thoughts, but just begin to notice them as they travel across your mind. Then let them go as they pass and watch them come and go. And then just continue to breathe, deepening your breath each time. Now we'll begin to describe some settings. Allow your mind to ease into those settings. Let your mind be free to travel. And try not to become attached to any one setting or image. Imagine you're a traveler jumping from place to place in your mind. Now imagine an ocean, a deep blue ocean, maybe a beach with white sand. And you can see a seagull flying over the sand. You maybe see some pelicans chasing the current over the waves crashing on the beach, the white sand. And then you see a desert. And you see a cactus in that desert. You look up and see a blue sky. A bird singing. And next to you is maybe a walled garden. Lush green grass. Maybe off in the distance, you see some storm clouds. And notice a cool breeze and a little crack of thunder. The dark sky starts to settle in, illuminated by lightning. A long dirt road stretching toward the horizon. As you walk the road, you see a grove of olive trees. You see a farmer. A woman pulling water from a well. You can hear and see children playing in the distance. As you continue, you see a tall tree stretching up to the sky. You notice and feel the warm sun on your skin, the mountains in the distance, maybe topped by snow. And now sunset comes in, You see the sun slowly setting in the distance. The white puffy clouds turning to redder tints. Birds flying off into the distance. So as you slowly start to come back, just think of that imagery, some of those calming sensations, as you go forward through the rest of the conference. Thank you. Come back as you see, as you settle into your body and get ready for the rest of the day.